Fethiye Irmak Doğan. So Fethiye is a Ph.D. student at the Division of Robotics, Perception and Learning at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And she's currently, as I know, in Georgia Tech. And her interests include this very exciting mixture between human-robot interaction, computer vision, and deep learning. And today she's going to talk to us about social robots that understand natural language instructions and resolve ambiguities. So, Irmak, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great introduction. Now I'm gonna start sharing my screen. I hope you all can see it.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank all of you to organize these great meetings. Actually, I am so excited to talk today about our research. And yeah, today I will start talking about social robots that understand natural language instructions and resolve ambiguities. Let's start. Verbal communication is a key challenge in human-robot interaction, as we all know. But what are the main components of this key challenge? The first important part is speech recognition, but existing text-to-speech and speech-to-text applications works pretty well to address this part of the challenge. On the other hand, natural language understanding still requires further exploration, actually. Yeah, let's assume that we have a user located in this area and asking a robot to bring the green book. What should the robot do? Firstly, it needs to identify that it needs to look for a book which is green. And whenever there are more than one object fitting to the description, as you see in here, there are two green books. It needs to find an efficient way to ask for clarifications to disambiguate the described object in this case. Like in here, which one? The one under the keyboard or to the right of the monitor, so that it would understand which object actually the user wants to bring up. So this is the main focus of my PhD. And now I'm gonna describe the components that should be fulfilled in order to achieve our goal. As we said, the user is located a space and asking for an object. In that case, the robot firstly needs to find the candidate regions that are fitting to the user's description, which are green books in that case. After that, it needs to uniquely describe, if there are more than one candidate, it needs to uniquely describe each of these objects to ask for follow-up clarification. As in here, it needs to first uniquely describe the green book to the right of the monitor, and the other one is the green book under the keyboard. And then these expressions should be used in the follow-up clarification, as in here, which one? The one under the keyboard or to the right of the monitor. This is the general pipeline that we wanna achieve in ambiguous scenarios, how to find objects, how to ask efficient clarification questions. And yeah, while describing objects, people generally use referring expressions. What are referring expressions? These are the expressions that are describing objects with their distinguishing features. It might contain color information, shape information, or the spatial relations regarding to the other objects. If we go back our pipeline, we would realize that the first part, finding the candidate regions that are fitting to the user's description, correspond to referring expression comprehension. And the second part, uniquely describing each of these candidates would correspond to referring expression generation. And yeah, let's start with referring expression comprehension. In this presentation, for the sake of time, I'm gonna just skip the literature review and just start with focusing on what are the open challenges in these items and how we aim to address these open challenges. The open challenges in referring expression generation, generally the previous works didn't focus on highly ambiguous real-world environments. As you see in this example, it's a very messy table, it's not structured, and it's not easy to actually make inferences, but the existing studies generally focused on lab environments. Everything is predetermined and pre-allocated. Another problem in the previous studies, they assume that the target candidates can be obtained by existing object detector or localization methods. Like in here, if your target is Brussels sprouts, it's almost impossible to detect these Brussels sprouts with the existing object detectors, because the existing detectors might work for mugs or plates, but it's not easy to detect these Brussels sprouts, basically. So whenever this is not in one of the candidate lists, the robot wouldn't even consider this part as the target object, so it won't be able to find this target object whenever user describes. And the existing studies also didn't focus on finding regions to ask for clarification whenever ambiguities. They didn't focus on, okay, if the user asks it for the green vegetable, maybe there are 2 green vegetables. They just focused on one region. They didn't aim to ask for clarification questions in case of ambiguities. And the last challenge we identified was they mostly focused on flat RGB images, and they didn't consider the depth feature. So to address the part of these first 3 challenges, we propose a method leveraging explainability. In our method, we use GradCam explainability module. What's this GradCam explainability module? It generally generates the activation heat map showing the parts that are contributing to other output predictions. For instance, in here, when the caption is a cat lying on the ground, this would be the part contributing to the inference task. And this is the generated activation heat map. And this method, GradCam, is basically applicable to any CNN-based models. And as I said, the image captioning model would generate the activation heat map, which contributes to the captions. Let's go back our task, not captioning, but referring expressions. We observed that GradCam method is also useful for referring expressions. How we observe that? For instance, in here, when the caption is your referring expression, people walking on the beach, it generates different heat map activation, and which is mostly on the human part of the scene. And whenever the referring expression is the cow standing on the beach, it's mostly on the animal part, the activation. So we said that, yeah, okay, then this can be, this image captioning module can be also used for referring expressions. So let's move on our model. Firstly, we have a user saying, can you bring the green vegetable, I'm sorry. You bring the green vegetable, and we generated the heat map activation using GradCam module. Then we computed the number of unconnected areas in this heat map activation. As you see in here, these unconnected areas are computed, the number of these unconnected areas. And this number is used in K-means clustering as the number of clusters, and we cluster this activation heat map using K-means. Then lastly, we suggested the regions with we suggested the clusters with the highest activations as the candidates in regions in here. This is the first candidate, this is the second candidate, and this is the third candidate. Yeah, let's move on evaluation. Firstly, we collected 25 different images with different difficulty levels. What we mean by difficulty, in the easy images, there were only few objects, and there was only one distractor per object. What's a distractor? Distractor is an object with the same type as the target object. In here, for instance, the other bubbles, except the target one, would be distractor objects. And there were only one distractor in the easy category. In medium difficulty, these were still commonly known objects that can be still detected by existing object detectors. But in that case, there were at least 3 distractors per target. And in the hard category, as you see in here, there were many distractor objects, and the objects were uncommon objects that mostly the existing object detectors would fail to detect. And then after collecting these scenes, we collected some expressions describing the target objects in these scenes. We asked an annotator to select one target object per image, and the annotator was blind to our research question. Then for each target object, we collected expressions using Amazon Mechanical Turk. We informed Amazon Mechanical Turk workers to describe objects as if they are describing it to a robot, to ensure that each of their description would correspond to a human-robot interaction, basically a request to a robot. So we collected 10 expressions per image, which yielded 250 interactions in total. To evaluate the results with these expressions, we compared our method with a state-of-the-art baseline. Firstly, we obtained the first 3 candidate boxes from the baseline method and also our method. And then we computed matching score between these 3 candidates and also the target object. How we computed this score is we used one scoring metric in the literature, which ensures the maximum intersection between 2 bounding boxes and aims to minimize the distance between center of masses. Lastly, we evaluated the proposed regions of our method for asking for clarification and resolving ambiguities. Let's move on our quantitative results. This is for easy images. We observed that basically baseline method works better than our method, which was expected for us because our method focuses on each region of the scene. But the baseline method focuses on detected objects. And in the easy category, there were only one distractor and all the objects were detectable. So the chance level of the baseline was way more higher than our method. So it was performing better in the easy category than our method. For the hard images, our method was successfully finding the target object in its first, second, or third candidate, more often, where the hard images contained many distractors and it contained tricky objects. Let's move on the qualitative results. In here, the red bounding boxes shows the target object, and the green bounding boxes shows the regions that are suggested by our method, the first candidate regions, basically. Are the original expressions obtained from M.Turk workers. This example with many fishes is very interesting, actually, because the user's expression in here, M.Turk user's expression in here, fits both of these identical fishes, basically. If you read like the white fish with yellow stripe just underneath the bigger yellow fish, the both of them might be that one, actually. In that case, our method was suggesting a region that contains partially both of these fishes. Now, the robot can only focus on this green region instead of the whole scene and ask for clarification for the user. Which one do you mean? This one or that one? So the regions suggested by our method could be used for asking clarifications. So that was the first method that we focused to address these first 3 challenges, but we were still relying on RGB images, and we weren't using the depth features at all while comprehending these expressions and finding the regions. But in real world, if you see this example, the mug next to the books, in 2D, actually, one might think that the mug closest to the books would be the one in the blue bounding box, but in reality, actually, in 3D, it's the one in the red bounding box. So depth information matters in this kind of comprehensions. So to address this challenge, we extended our work with the depth features. We observed that GradCam is also applicable for depth dimension of the data, depth features, depth channel of the data. In here, this is the RGB image, and the expression is the microwave closer to the table. And in the RGB image activations is this one, and also the depth activations are still feasible to contribute to output predictions. So how we extended our work? For a given scene and the depth dimension, we obtained 2 activations using GradCam module, one from RGB channel and the other from depth channel. And then we combined these RGB and depth activations to show the common active areas in these 2 activations. This is the combined activations showing the common active areas. And lastly, we followed the same procedure. We firstly computed the number of unconnected areas, and we used this number in the K-means clustering as the number of clusters and we applied clustering to these combined activations. So again, the clusters with the highest activations are suggested as the regions containing the target object. This is the first candidate, when the ball next to the glass, this is the first candidate, this is the second, and this is the third one. So let's move on evaluation, how the depth improved or whether improved or not improved the performance. To evaluate this, we collected 70 different scenes from SunRGBD dataset, and we labeled half of this dataset as easy and the half of this dataset is difficult. What are the easy images? Easy images are the ones which doesn't contain depth-dependent features, basically, like the pen to the left of the banana is not dependent on the depth feature. But in the difficult category, the features were depth-dependent, like the bottle with a yellow cap closest to the napkins. To identify which one is the closest to the napkins, the depth feature plays a critical role. So we had both depth-dependent and independent features in our evaluation set. And to evaluate our method, we compared the results with depth features and without depth features. The one that I just described, this one in our results is called as RGBD method with the depth features. And the one I explained before from the RGB images with GradCam is called as RGB method, and it tried to find the described regions without depth features. Let's see. In our results, we have shown that in our whole evaluation dataset containing depth-dependent and independent features, using the depth improves the performance. So the method, RGBD method with the depth features could find the target object in its first, second, and third candidate more often than the RGB method without depth features. And also in the difficult category, we observed that depth features improve the comprehension. However, we didn't observe any significant differences for the easy category, which was expected because easy category was containing depth-independent features. So using depth either in RGBD method or RGB method didn't change the performance in that case. And let's move on our qualitative results. We have shown that, again, in here, the red bounding boxes are the target object bounding boxes, and the green bounding boxes in here are the boxes suggested, the first candidates suggested by RGBD method with depth features, and the ones in the second row is the ones without depth features from RGB method. And we have shown that whenever the depth-dependent expressions were provided, the RGBD method performed better to find the described objects. In here, as you see, for instance, the chair in front of the fridge, and the method was successfully identify the described object. So this was the first part where I talked about referring expression compression. So basically finding the regions that are fitting to the user's description. Do you have any question about the first parts? Or otherwise, I will continue with the next part. Okay, yeah, let's continue with the next part then. After finding these regions, we aim to uniquely describe these candidate regions in order to ask clarifications, right? So now we are going to focus on referring expression generation part. Again, I'm going to skip the literature on referring expression generation for sake of the time, but I'm going to focus on what are the open challenges we identified for referring expression generation. The previous methods mostly focused on hand-designed rules and thresholds. And they didn't, again, focus on highly ambiguous real-world environments. And lastly, while generating these expressions, they didn't consider the user's perspective. They didn't take the user's perspective into account. They didn't consider where the user is located. So they didn't generate an expression from the user's perspective, where to the left, to the right, in front, behind would change depending on your perspective in the real world. Firstly, to address the first two challenges, we suggested a method, a learning-based method, to generate natural and unambiguous spatially referring expressions. Sorry. In our method to generate the spatial referring expressions, firstly, we detected objects by using Mascar CNN. Then the detected objects are provided into the first network, relation presence network, and this network identifies the spatial relations between each of these detected objects. And then these spatial relations are provided into the second network, relation informativeness network, which provided the most informative relation to describe the target object. And using the most informative spatial relation, we generated expressions like this ones, the book to the right of the mouse. Oops. And to evaluate our method, we conducted a user study. And we compared the generated expressions with the state-of-the-art baseline in 65 indoor and outdoor images. And we asked 61 human judges to evaluate the generated expressions, both our method and the baseline method. And they evaluated the expressions considering correctly finding the described objects and also the naturalness of the expressions. Let's start with the first experiment. In the first experiment, we provided users a scene with object bounding boxes, and we provided an expression either generated by our method or the baseline method. And we asked them, what does this expression basically referring to, which object it's referring to. And the results show that whenever the expressions were generated from our method, users could correctly find the correct objects more often. And also they had a chance to say that the expression was unclear, so I couldn't identify the target object. And they labeled our expressions less unclear compared to the baseline method. And let's move on now, the second experiment. In this experiment, again, we provide users a scene, and this time one target object. And we provide two expressions, one from our method and one from the baseline method. And we ask users which one you would be more likely to use while describing this target object. And the results show that most of the time, people prefer to use our method compared to the baseline. And they had also option to say both or neither are applicable to describe the object. So in this work, we aim to propose a method, a learning-based method to describe objects spatially, but we weren't still taking the user's perspective into account while generating these expressions. We were generating the expressions from a single scene. So to address the third challenge, we extended this work with perspective-taking module. This part, I just described how we generate spatial relations from a single perspective. And it's extended with perspective-taking module to describe objects from user's perspective. To achieve this, we firstly collected different views of a scene from different viewpoints. Then we detect the user by using Mascar CNN. And we identify the depth of the user using a calibrated RGBD camera. Then we computed the Euclidean distance between the user and each of these viewpoints, and we select the viewpoint which is closest to the user as the view from the user's perspective. And we use this view to generate the referring expression from the user's perspective, as you see in here. In that case, the robot was generating expressions like the bottle that you see to the left of the banana. Let's move on our experiments, how we evaluated perspective-taking module. We conducted another user study with 89 participants to evaluate the impacts of perspective-taking. We have two conditions. In the perspective-taking condition, the robot was describing some objects on the table from the user's perspective. And in the control condition, the robot was describing objects from its own perspective. And this was between subject studies. So the users were either experiencing the perspective-taking condition or the control condition. how the experimental setup looks like. Users start the experiment in this side, and after the robot is describing each object, the users are rotating around the table to change their perspective each and every time. And in the perspective taking condition, the robot was generating expressions like the bottle that you see to the left of the mouse. And in the control condition, the robot was generating expressions like the apple that I see behind the mouse. So the robot was explicit about which perspective it was referring to the object. Let's see our results, what happened during the study. In our hypothesis, we thought that people would spend less time whenever the objects were described from their perspective, which was indeed the case. As you see, people spent less time in the perspective taking condition compared to the control condition. And they committed fewer mistakes, which means they could identify the described objects more often in the perspective taking condition when the objects were described from their own perspective. And they also perceived the task as easier whenever the objects were described from their perspective. However, we didn't observe any significant differences about the perception of the robot's perspective taking abilities and its social presence between the perspective taking and control conditions. So there were no differences between these conditions. Okay, now firstly, we talked about how to find regions that matches with the user's description. Then we aim to uniquely describe each of these matching regions. And now it's time for asking for clarification, combining these two methods and asking users, okay, which one you mean basically. Before moving how we aimed to address this challenge, let's look at what are the open challenges in this problem. The previous methods, whenever there are ambiguities, just ask users to repeat their request basically. Consider Alexa, whenever you have a request and the Amazon Alexa couldn't understand you, it would only say, oops, I couldn't get you. It wouldn't say you, did you mean this or did you mean that? And also, whenever there are ambiguities or unknown parts in the user's request, there might be still some known parts that the robot could understood, and it can focus on the understood part of the request to ask for clarifications, but the existing methods didn't aim to address these challenges. So we suggested an interactive system to ask for follow-up clarifications using the familiar concepts and the familiar objects in the request and in the environment to resolve the ambiguities. Firstly, whenever the user asks, can you hand me the green vegetable? We firstly, again, identify the regions that are fitting to the user's description as before. First, the GradCam activations, then K-means clustering, and the clusters with the highest activations is suggested as the candidate regions. We found the candidate regions, and we know that there are more than one regions fitting to the request. And then we identify the detectable objects in the environment. As you see in here, the artichoke, the basil, these are not detectable objects by existing object detectors, but like the knife, banana, apple, these are detectable objects. So we find the detectable objects in the scene, and we have two candidates. Using these detectable objects and the candidates, we generated a referring expression as before, firstly finding the relations between objects and the most informative relation, and then the expression like, and we generate a yes-no question like this one. Is the green vegetable to the left of the knife? Now it's trying to ask whether it's this region. Is the green vegetable to the left of the knife? If the user says yes, then the robot will focus on this part. If the user says no, it will continue the second candidate. So yeah, let's move on to experiments. To evaluate our method, we arranged two tabletop setups. This is the first setup, and this is the second setup. In the setup, people describe some objects to the robot, and the robot aimed to find the objects they describe. They follow order while describing objects. They started with this object and continued second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. And then whenever they're done with the first setup, they continued with the second setup, and they described the objects second order. And why we have two setups, you are gonna just see it right now, because we had two conditions. But before going to that, the experiment was with 63 participants, and this was within subject. And in both conditions, the users were describing objects to the robot. In the clarification condition, whenever there were ambiguities, the robot was asking questions like, is the green vegetable to the left of the knife? But in the control condition, when there were ambiguities, it was asking, can you describe the object again, as in the application of many previous studies. And which condition the robot starts to experiment was counterbalanced during the experiment. So the people were always, people were always starting the setup with this first setup, then the experiment with the first setup, then they were continuing with the second setup. But the order they started experiment, either clarification condition or control condition, was counterbalanced. Let's move on our results. What happened during the experiment? Firstly, our hypothesis was the robot could find the described objects more often whenever it was asking user clarification questions, and which was indeed true, As you see in here, the robot could find the objects correctly, more accurately in clarification condition more often than the control condition. And these unknown objects corresponds to attempts that are expired. After some point, the robot gave up either asking for redescription or clarification to not annoy users. So these unknown objects shows the expired trials. So in the control condition, there were more expired trials compared to the clarification one. Let's move on our second hypothesis. We thought that it would take fewer attempts to identify the described object in the clarification condition when the robot asked for clarification. This is the initial request. And as you see, for the initial request, there are no significant differences between conditions because they were following the same procedure to find when it was the initial request. But whenever there were ambiguities in the first attempts and the second attempts in clarification condition, the robot was able to find the objects more often. In the first attempt in clarification, it was asking for follow-up clarifications, but for the control one, it was asking to redescribe over and over and over again. And in here, expired attempts were less for the clarification condition compared to the control one. Our third hypothesis was people would perceive the task as easier whenever the robot was asking clarification questions instead of redescriptions, and which was actually true, which was supported with our results. And the last hypothesis was, we thought that people would perceive the robot's task understanding and the competence as higher when it was asking for clarification questions. And as you see, the average scores were higher for the clarification condition. So let's move to conclusion. I started presenting with referring expression comprehension, basically how to find described objects, how to find the objects that are fitting to the user's description. I firstly explained our method based on explainability and GradCam module. Then I described how we improve this method with the depth features to improve the comprehension. After that, we moved on referring expression generation part to generate expressions to uniquely describe the objects in the scene. I described how our spatial referring expression generation method, then our extension to take user's perspective into account while describing objects. And lastly, I talked about how we can combine this comprehension and generation to resolve ambiguities. And I presented our work on asking for follow-up clarifications in that case. So thank you so much for your kind attention. And if you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Irmak. Please join me in congratulating Irmak for the incredible talk. I would just kindly ask to stop sharing the screen for a bit so we
Sure.
can see everyone. And we now open the session for Q&A. So if you have any question, please just unmute yourself and you can ask. So the first one is always the hardest, so I'll go first. So, Irmak, in all of your work, it seems that the robot or the agent has access to all types of objects that exist in the environment. And for me, I think it's also interesting to think about this as a symbol grounding problem, right? How can we actually ground the perceptions that we have into the real world? And so my question would be, how can we extend, or could we use your framework to generate referral or references, spatial references to objects that the robot might not know what it is?
That's a great question. Actually, while comprehending them, we were aiming to do that. Like, for instance, for the artichoke, maybe robot doesn't know what artichoke is, but still it can, if you say green vegetable, it might know the green concept, so it can just at least focus on the green objects in the environment. While comprehending that, we were doing, and while generating these expressions, we weren't. That's true. I agree. Actually, for clarification questions, we were being a bit tricky, and whatever the way user referred to the objects, we were just taking the way they referred and trying to generate an expression with their references. But for sure, to generate just an unknown object with using the known concepts would be an amazing extension to this work.
Okay, thank you, Irmak. Are there any questions?
Yeah, hi, I had a question for you, Irmak. First, thank you for the amazing talk. So my question was that when I noticed most of the descriptions had both a qualitative aspect describing the character, maybe the color or maybe the type of stuff. Apart from that, there was also some kind of a positional or a relative relationship. Like you had something mentioned about that maybe the objects on the left or the objects behind. So were you able to, distinguish the contributions of these two, like how much contribution is being provided by the nature of the object and how much contribution is being provided by the physical aspect, like where it's located and stuff?
Yeah, actually, these two questions are a bit correlated with each other. For instance, how I think the robot is working in these scenarios is that whenever it doesn't know the object, it doesn't know the artichoke, but you said that it's to the left of the keyboard and it knows keyboard. In that case, it's focusing at least the regions with the keyboard to find, okay, I know this object, so let's find this. But whenever it knows the object itself, like an apple, and if you say the red apple in that case, it knows the apple, so just look for a red apple. So I think it's contributing whenever the object is unknown to the robot, it's focusing on the spatial information that you provide, considering the other objects. But whenever it's non-object, it's just focusing on objects' own features.
That makes sense. Thank you.
So I have a follow-up question. Could you integrate information from other modalities than not just vision? So for example, concepts like soft, hard, those kinds of information.
This is actually what now we are talking with Sonia for my future studies in Georgia Tech. Actually, we were always assuming that just the visual information, whatever the robot can understand, but there are some properties that doesn't change that much. If you are looking for a clean cup, it's probably in the cupboard, for instance. It's not in the dishwasher, mostly. So you can use this type of other like soft, hard, clean, empty, this kind of information would matter where to look for. So hopefully this will be my future research, to start searching from a larger space, the robot is located in a larger space, and it's gonna consider the other dimensions and other features of the object in order to start searching, then finding the described object and asking for clarifications in that case.
Yeah, because that's interesting, right? Because you have only not other types of perceptual concepts, but you
That's
also have some
true.
concepts that require some cognition, like clean and dirty, right?
Yep.
It's not entirely perceptual. It doesn't come directly from the raw observations that we get.
I totally agree. And there are some abstract concepts actually. If you ask a robot to bring a knife to cut something, probably you are meaning a clean knife. You are not meaning a dirty one. But if you are saying that, yeah, I'm gonna wash the knife, can you bring it? Then you are looking for a dirty one, basically. Then in these cases, the robot needs to focus on different objects and focus on actually, maybe it makes more sense to ask, do you want the cup or the knife whenever asking for clarification when you ask for something dirty. But if you're asking for something clean, then maybe it makes more sense to open the cupboard. So these type of properties really matter to understand the user's request.
Exactly. So, is there any question in the chat? People.
I wanted to ask Irmak if you are also considering moving objects.
In the experiments, actually, I forgot to tell that. We were asking users whenever they were describing objects or whenever the robot was describing objects to move the object from the table. So it was a dynamic system during these experiments as well. It wasn't pre-located objects for us. We had the external webcam camera to observe the scene, and we were extracting whatever information we can get at that immediate time. But yeah, in general, like we are aiming to obtain an autonomous system. But again, as Miguel said, for instance, to generate for a random object an expression is still challenging for us. Like if you don't know what is artichoke, it's still tricky for us to generate an expression describing artichoke. Comprehension in that sense is easier because you can use the known concepts, but while generating, I think it's a bit trickier.
Thank you, Irmak. Is there any question in the chat?
I can't see the chat, unfortunately.
Or I still have several questions for you. So, when you were generating these referring expressions with perspective taking, right? Considering the viewpoint that is closest to the user. But what would happen if, for example, that viewpoint has some sort of occlusion that does not allow him to observe completely the...
That's a great question, actually. That would be initially our idea was also considering the occlusion, but we ended up just assuming that all the objects are visible. But in perspective taking, this is a very important module, like occlusions would happen for sure. And then you need to know which object and how to describe them. So yeah, occlusions would be an important part of this problem. Since our method was taking the scene from different viewpoints, in occlusions, it would still supposed to work. But yeah, I know this is not the pretty solution ever, but we were mostly focusing on whether perspective taking would matter or not. So we were going for the most straightforward option you could go. Observe the scene from different viewpoints, and we observed that just for around 45-degree differences would be still enough to not to change the spatial relations that much. To the left, to the right wouldn't change that much. So we were going for the most straightforward solution, and I agree that there are prettier solutions to resolve this problem. Our challenge in that case was, for instance, we wanted to have an autonomous system. We didn't want to pre-locate all the objects, and in 3D. The object detectors are still immature to use in human-robot interaction. So we had to use everything in 2D. So whenever it's in 2D, we had to collect all the scenes. So that was the challenge, basically.
So Philippa has a question in chat. Philippa, you want to take it or you can't? Okay, I will take that as a no. So Philippa asks, have you thought about linking your work to the cognitive literature related to theory of mind and assess the perceived intentionality agency of the robot?
Yeah, that's a great question. It would be a very nice extension for sure. We were trying to understand how people perceive the robot during the interaction, but there can be for sure further investigation on that side as well. We didn't do that much. We were just basically asking users to scale how difficult was the task, how clever was the robot, how do you just evaluate the competence of the robot, this type of questions. But yeah, further investigation is required to make some conclusions for sure.
And that also has very interesting connections to the work of Iolanda Leite, which is right now at KTH as well. And she literally works on perspective taking. So I think there's a lot of bridges there that would be interesting to explore for sure.
Yeah, we talked a bit with her. Exactly, like there are some commonalities that we are interested in for sure.
So unfortunately, our time has run up. So if you want to ask more questions, please contact Irmak or through our Slack channel, where we're going to open a post Q&A session with Irmak. And once again, let me congratulate Irmak and join me in congratulating Irmak on her amazing talk and work. And I would like just to give you takes 2 more minutes of your time to introduce the next speaker. So our next session will not be on the 26th of November, but it's going to be in 2 weeks, and we're going to have Krishnamurti from Mila and the Robotics and Embodied AI Lab in University of Montreal. So please join us for that also amazing presentation, and it's going to be the last one before Christmas. So you should attend it, or else you'll end up in the naughty list. We would like to thank our sponsors, Animatas and Semio, for making Talking Robotics a reality and helping us with our structure. And also, if you like this seminar series and you want to support us, please, you can buy us the coffee. I think the link will be in the chat. And you can help us also support our infrastructure costs, such as the Zoom account that we are currently using. And having said that, see you in 2 weeks.